you said, I think demand generation doesn't exist. And
I do.
just by reading that, I thought I have to talk to him. So you said the definition doesn't make sense. You can't generate demand.
No,
And you say a lot of other things, but yeah, maybe you can take me through the article.
Yeah, sure. So before I do that, I have to say I've had this discussion numerous times with a lot of people, and I haven't heard any kind of argument that can make me question what I'm about to say. I haven't. Like, I've talked with a lot of people, and I haven't seen anything that makes sense. And usually what happens is that people just stop responding because they're out of arguments, and they want to believe, because there's something called cognitive dissonance, which pushes us to tell ourselves stories instead of actually accepting reality. So the reason I don't think demand generation exists is I don't think you can generate demand. If you think about it, I mean, it's not if you think about it, it's the definition of demand. It's wants plus needs. So someone has to want something and someone has to need something. Okay. So, and this is very important. It's not just wants, or it's not just needs, right? For example, people may want to have a pizza oven that also functions as an alarm clock, but they don't need one. Okay. Because demand is wants plus needs, how can you generate demand? How can you create demand in the market? There is only, I lied. There is one way to do that. One way to create demand, and it's to create a problem, because people will then want and need a solution to that problem. So there are multiple examples of that throughout history. If you want an old example of that, you take the shampoo industry in the 50s telling women, running big advertising campaigns to tell women that washing their hair only once a week was really bad. So what they did is they created demand for shampoo because they created a problem. Your hair is actually really filthy if you only wash it once a week, and if you don't wash it with the product, that's creating a problem. Another example, which is maybe less ethical or politically correct, is Coca-Cola putting caffeine in Coke, right? They're creating a problem. They're creating the addiction, and then you have to buy Coke to fulfill your addiction. Another fun example is the gold rush, right? During the gold rush, who made the most money? People selling shovels and people selling mining equipment, because that the problem was there. The want and the need was there. If you don't have wants and needs, you don't have demand. So you cannot create demand for a product that doesn't exist, right? So then the argument that people use at this stage is, oh yeah, but Steve Jobs, and it's always the same. It's always Steve Jobs and the iPhone, right? But Steve Jobs created demand for the iPhone because he created a product that didn't exist. Yeah. So my answer to that is, so the argument is basically, if the product doesn't exist, then creating the product creates the demand. So I have to ask a question that invalidates this argument completely. If there was a way right now for you to teleport yourself from wherever you're living to the bottom of the Tour Eiffel in Paris, would you do it? And you go like, yeah, sure. If it's a safe way, I'd do it. There is demand for a very fast, faster mode of transportation, safer mode of transportation. There is the demand. We just don't have the product. The fact that the product doesn't exist doesn't implies that the demand doesn't exist, right? It doesn't change.
Yeah, that's a good one, because I think that's the case in a lot of examples I see. The problem is already there. The demand is there. You just are the first solution that people see of a company who can fix the problem. And then maybe they need to be a little bit convinced that your solution is the best. So can't that be demand generation? The problem is already there, the demand is there, but your solution for the problem, you can create demand for that.
So exactly, that's the next thing, the next argument in line. The next argument in line is, I am not creating demand in the market. I am creating demand for my company. Okay? And I think that is a very misleading argument. It's the one you just made, right? One, this is not at all what these people claim they're doing. Not at all. They're they are claiming to create market demand, right? In their narrative, this is what they're doing.
I used this argument a few times before, the argument you are giving. So then I said van, okay, but for me, I don't believe too in creating real demand for the product or service. I do believe in creating demand for people, for the company, for the content that you create.
Great.
But why don't we call it branding then? Why does it need a new
Exactly.
name?
Then this is my question: is if this is what you're claiming to do, why
Or
are you
content
calling
marketing.
it demand generation, right? And the fact that
Yep.
you're calling it demand generation shows that this is not what you're claiming to do. Otherwise, you just call it brand awareness, the way we've called that for the past, I don't know, 100 years or something, right?
Yeah,
So
no,
that
to
doesn't
be honest,
really make sense either.
I like what it stands for. I like what people do with demand generation. Only I think it's maybe a bit too specific. So it's a very specific framework, and it's also became big based on maybe even some lies about inbound marketing and lead generation.
Yeah.
They frame lead generation in a way which maybe is lead generation for a lot of companies, but doesn't have to be lead generation. Lead generation can be very valuable and good marketing as well, I think. Not only low quality white papers at the top of the funnel of people who never are going to convert. So, yeah, I have some problems with that. But
well, I mean, yeah, and this is maybe a thing I didn't say, but I don't think demand generation doesn't work. I think what works when people do demand gen is not demand gen, and I can explain that pretty simply. I just want to make another argument for people who are not convinced at this time, and the argument is this: is if you claim you can generate demand, how do you measure it? How much? In other words, how much is one demand?
okay,
right?
This one is interesting because you can measure it, but if you can't measure something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right?
But I'm not the one claiming it exists, okay? And that's called reversal of the burden of proof. These people are claiming they can generate demand. These people need to back up their claim. I am not claiming I can generate demand, right? So that the reversal of the burden of proof. The burden of proof lies on whoever makes the claim, right?
Yeah,
if I make the claim that if I drop this glass specifically in my office, it's going to go up instead of down, then I need to be able to back up that claim and actually show it. And I can't hide behind we can't measure it. Okay. So the argument people use to respond to that is, well, we measure it by leads, but wait, because they're not exactly the same leads, we only measure the real leads that are ready to buy. So only SQLs and not MQLs, because MQLs are bullshit, and you've been, that argument. Yep. So in the end, if what you're claiming to generate is demand, and what you actually measure it with are leads, then aren't you just generating leads, right?
Well,
what's the difference?
I see a lot of people on LinkedIn who call them opportunities and not sales qualified leads.
Okay, yeah, you can do that, but
that's a definition
thing. Yeah, I don't find that very convincing. And all these arguments piling up, I haven't seen anyone make any claim to counteract anything I've said. And so usually people will hide behind but it still works. I don't know. I think I'm big into evidence-based marketing. So actually looking at data and research and understanding what works and what doesn't in marketing, so we can actually do more of what works and less of what doesn't. And some people in that community, and I can recommend a couple books, is say stuff like nonsensical jargon leads to nonsensical thinking, and nonsensical thinking leads to failure, right? So it's very important, because another argument people will make is like, but it's semantics. Yes, it is. It is semantics. But
I thought that was going to be, I thought that was going to be the end conclusion of this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I have a better, I think I have because saying demand generation doesn't make sense. That's one thing. That's me being a prick, and that's fine. But I think we can do more of that. I think, like I said, what works in demand gen isn't demand gen. It's the fact that people actually do some kind of marketing work. Um, we live in a world where 90 something percent of marketers do not have marketing training. Or if they have marketing training, it's like 5 classes that they took in business school with like a guy from the 60s who was on payroll with the school, whatever. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And that's a whole different issue, but this is usually what happens. And so all of these marketers, when they come to jobs, they kind of go with the flow. They go with what's already there in companies, and they replicate what they see in companies. And they go out on social media, on LinkedIn, on the web. They listen to these podcasts and for advice, because they're not trained to properly do their job. And so they listen to whoever is the most convincing. It's usually the 30 to 40 something white guy with a beard and a podcast who is very handsome and speaks in a very eloquent manner, right? That's usually what happens. And if that guy happens to be filling their heads with BS, then, to sell his services, then so be it. And they replicate whatever they hear from that guy. Marketing has 3 components. Any marketing project, whatever you're doing, digital marketing, traditional marketing, whatever, has 3 components. The first one is diagnosis. We need to research the market, understand who we need to target, what these people are thinking, what their problems are, what they try to fix the problem, how do we fit against these alternatives, why would they choose one over the other, etc. That's called market research, right?
Yep.
No one does that today in marketing departments. No one. The second thing is once we know that, we're going to put together a plan. We're going to strategize, and because we know who to target, we know who they are, we can understand how we reach them. We can tailor our positioning and messaging. We can do all that stuff to reach the right people. No one does that either. And then the third thing is execution. This is where you go, should we do SEO, social? Should we do brand awareness campaign, TV advertising, display ads? Should we sponsor newsletters? Should we do et cetera, et cetera? Everyone does this. And what happens is people do not have 1 and 2, and they focus on 3. And when 3 doesn't work, they blame it on the tactic. SEO is dead. Lead generation is dead. Inbound marketing is dead. You need to switch to demand gen. You need to shift from A to Z, etc. The whole thing you see on LinkedIn all the time is because people didn't do 1 and 2.
I think you are right, but I think there's another part of the problem, and that is that all things work for a few years, and then everybody is doing it, and it doesn't work anymore. And I think that's also a little bit what happened with lead generation. And that's why we want something else now.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think the discussion is still on number 3. When you say this works, this doesn't, okay, that's a tactic thing, okay? Like probably mailing DVDs at some point worked and it doesn't anymore. That's fine. You still have the same target audience. They still have the same problem. You're still fixing that problem, maybe in different ways, but it doesn't change the fact that you can still reach that target audience. What you're saying is, we can shift our strategy based on the market trends and stuff. And yeah, I agree with that. You should, definitely. But until people do 1 and 2, until people understand their customers and the problems they solve and what the alternatives are, and put together a plan to actually put that across to them, then until they do that, they're stuck with tactics. And what happens when you're stuck with tactics is that you think that every problem is a tactical problem. And so you go like, oh no, we can't do SEO because SEO doesn't work and it's too long term, right? Or, yeah, but what if we change our ad creative? Maybe that's why the ads aren't performing. Or, yeah, but this landing page is not properly optimized. Maybe we should optimize that, and then we see where the budget should go, right? And so that you go into busy work mode. This is busy work. because you have no, you don't know what the market is, and you don't have a plan to reach your market. So obviously you do that.
I had a conversation a few weeks ago with a company, and they hired an agency for inbound marketing, very big, famous Dutch agency. And it didn't work. It didn't get any results. And then they started A/B testing the landing page. But they didn't even have any traffic there. So, it's things like that that cause a lot of problems. And now they are looking for new ways how to get leads because this isn't working. But yeah.
But you see what I mean? They're stuck in that tactical execution mindset where what they need to do is stop everything. The problem is that this politically in organizations, it's really hard to do. Like if you were to hire someone like me and you want me to be the CMO of your startup and you ask me what the first move is, I'm going to be like, for 3 months, we're going to stop everything we're doing and we're going to rebuild whatever we're doing. And no one's going to hire me to do that. Because it's just politically, no one wants their marketing department to stop working for 3 months. But it's not.
The same company that I just talked about, I also said to them, what you are looking for doesn't exist. You have a wrong idea of what marketing is and what the results are in the short term that you can get with it.
Exactly.
And I didn't start working for them because they are still searching for something that they are not going to find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think most people, so that everything that I said leads me to say that actually most marketing departments in companies are not doing marketing. They're doing campaign management. And that's a very different skill set. That's a very different thing. And so what they need to do is to start doing marketing, which is, what is my product? What is the market? How am I going to put that product on the market, right? And this is where I go back to what I was saying. I think what works in demand gen is not demand gen. It's the fact that with that demand gen approach, people stop thinking about how am I going to get people to convert, and they start thinking about who are these people and what should we say to them? And that's just because they start doing marketing. It's not the demand gen part.